Hello, Daniel.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
So, um, many directions we could go in. Are any calling to you particularly today?
Not necessarily, just let the ball roll and see where it ends up. It's like a golden board or one of these pinball toys. Let's just shoot it somewhere and we'll improvise.
Excellent. So what have you been working on recently?
There are lots of things I'm working on. Basically, I try to understand empowerment better. There are lots of directions in which this is going to go. The point is, everybody expects me to talk about that, so I won't. I'll switch to something else. There are other questions that bug me, and questions that I find very interesting are questions about how to organize cognition. How do we actually structure the world around us? And one of the things that I found always very intriguing is that, first of all, we can't do that at all. So the one question that, of course, has bugged many people. Apologize for this noise. I don't know how to turn it off. So occasionally there will be these beeps. So I apologize in advance. I don't really know how to turn it off.
That's quite all right.
Probably take me 5 to 10 minutes to find out how. So the question that, Einstein asked the question, how come that we can actually understand the world in a formal and mathematical way? And I do think this is a very deep question, because in my opinion, it lies at the bottom of what makes intelligence and life so surprising. So if you will look at life, I mean, we probably can kind of imagine, okay, you can get to a level of a protobacterium or a bacterium, some kind of chemical bag that does some metabolism and then is stuck there. It doesn't move further. You can perhaps say, okay, multicellularity, well, you make it a little bit more complex, you get somewhere else. And you can get to something like the dinosaurs, which are pretty good, pretty complex, but at the end of the day, you get stuck there, and that's it. That's the end of evolution. And then dinosaurs have been around for a very long time, far longer than we are away from them. So in other words, there's no reason that dinosaurs would have had any pressure to evolve anywhere else, if not for, the meteorite that basically killed them and created stress onto the biosphere. And again and again and again, we see this effect that where you can Homo erectus, I think we talked about that, has been around, say, a long time, not sure exactly how long, probably 2 million years, something like that, probably. And that's fine. You sit there and you're perfectly viable as a species. And suddenly we get humans, which suddenly completely break the mold of what's possible. And we're not that different biologically from our ancestors. We have some differences, but they're not massive. So the big question is, why can we make this step? And second, what properties of the world allow us to then, in addition to making the step of creating culture and language and all these things, to actually introspect into the world in a constructive way? You see, I always imagine an alternative universe in which we might have evolved even to the level of Galilei. And you can imagine Galileo Galilei in this alternative world, thinking about, well, there must be structure to the world and we must be able to formulate it. And then it turns out, well, actually, Adam and Eve are the true story. There's no further reconstruction of the world. There's no actual evolution. There's no physics. There's no structure to the world. World is as such, as is. Think of it something like, this virtual worlds like Second Life. People build that. It has been like that from the beginning, from the outset when it starts. it has a certain structure, and there's no further deconstruction of how it came to pass. And that is really an interesting insight. The world does have structure, and it has a history, and it's consistent. I do think that there's something very interesting to be taken from this as a lesson. And the question that we have to ask is, number one, what does that tell us about our cognition? Because we are able to introspect in that, to reconstruct it. It tells us something about how our brain works. It tells us about how our brain is constrained, and it tells us how the world is constrained to achieve this.
The fact that our cognition and its sophistication is possible at all, its constraints on the kind of world we are in. It's a kind of anthropics in terms of like not all worlds would support cognizers such as us. So not only do we have to have certain capacities, but we have to be in a world such that it could support those capacities. Not all worlds would be able to support the kind of cognition we engage in. And not just any kind, but a kind that when it takes certain forms, I think you might have called it two things you say to come to mind. One, the singularity in the past, and also the first true human is the one who like imagined flying, or who looked up and said, "I'm this counterfactual ability, this ability to entertain like."
Exactly, and it's actually a triple whammy. It's a triple whammy, or I didn't count the whammies. So you have number one, it needs to support the emergence of cognition. Number two, it needs to support the emergence of cognition that's kind of intersubjective in a way that you can actually transfer knowledge from one to another in a portable way, right? Not just from one individual to another to copy a skill or something, really to copy abstract things that have not been seen by there are maybe several links away from the original. That's something that's very uniquely human. Animals can copy each other, but they don't usually, it's not easy for them to learn things over multiple generations. They can, but it's usually single skills. It's not a whole library of skills they can learn. And the third is that humans' abilities can introspect in a way that can reconstruct how the world actually works. And that is really, the multiple levels of in which it has to work makes, in my opinion, the anthropic principle turns it into a real non-trivial constraint. So some people have called the anthropic principle trivial. I don't agree with this. I don't think it's trivial at all. I think it has quite a strong set of constraints upon what worlds are possible that not only support the emergence of life, but support the emergence of cognition, and in fact support the emergence of introspective cognition. That is not arbitrary. Not all worlds support that. Some worlds might support the emergence of bacteria, say, maybe even organisms that can act cognitively and discover things, which, discover how to hunt food and so on. But this introspection, for that to work, you need another level of structure in the world, because the world could be actually quite nasty. You could imagine, I mean, this is just a hypothetical thinking, that we as humans, we would not be as we are, but we would be kind of cloud beings. So beings that live as clouds and are kind of not really well individualized, not clear individuals, not clear forms, no clear gravity. So we have 3D, but without structure, amoeba-like think. And now we have a problem. Now we lose, first of all, it's not clear what is individual. Counting becomes an issue. I think we lost the connection. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, good. So counting becomes an issue.
I was just thinking about what it would look like if we had partial sentiences evolving in like the atmosphere of Jupiter or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It is a kind of plasma with ill-defined boundaries, with ill-defined,
Or rather,
and
is that even possible? And I think you're starting to suggest ways in which actually no, it might not be possible. It wouldn't have the right pressures nor affordances.
exactly that is another problem that could happen. But even if it had, let's even entertain the thought that it might not be able to actually consider the concept of counting. It might not be able to consider the concept of speed, because everything is kind of, there's no direction, there's no coherent direction, and so on. So we do have the concept of counting because individuality is something that we deal with all the time. We are one individual, there's another individual, and we see other individuals that are well identifiable. When that's not the case, we have ways of measuring that, but then it's the concept of counting disappears. And in fact, if we could not count, if say you would be a lone individual that very long lifetime, and you would only deal with uncountable stuff, so things that like water or some gelatin mass or things that are not countable, I think you would have a hard time inventing math, because you would, much of math starts with counting. I mean, perhaps Euclidean
Does
geometry
the
might be
type
possible.
token distinction in terms of like abstraction depend on this also? The relation, but
It might be. I need to be careful because geometry still might be possible. Okay, so geometry does not require counting. You just need the concept of what is a straight line and things like that. And that is something that works because we can, see far, and we can look at straight lines and things like that.
the great red spot is over there. We are here. Here's another. I'm just thinking of like there could be like geometric relations still, even if there aren't stable entities.
Yes, you could still do that. Where it would get difficult is in water, for example. If you were, say, an octopus, and we are now really toying around. We do a Gedanken experiment. So you had an octopus, really intelligent. The octopus will have a little bit of a problem, the directionality to a certain distance. Maybe there would have to be a brilliant octopus that realizes that this can be extended beyond the visible distance. It's not obvious. Everything in the world of the octopus has limits, and the vision of humans goes very far. So it's not difficult for humans to imagine you can go further than that, so infinite distances. But maybe an octopus that lives in a finite appearing world would say, yeah, but lines don't go further than that. And you would have an orthodoxy of octopuses, of octopus priests, that would say, no, there's nothing beyond the lines that are longer than 30 meters or something like that. Yeah, of course, this is quite an absurd invention, but assuming octopus had a language and they could think in terms of geometry, things like that do happen. Humans have done exactly that. They've said, okay, the Earth is only that big, and the moon is only that far, and they have made these types of assumptions.
Is there a range in terms of like, so you're bringing up like so the world could be far nastier to cognize, or like making things like, are there worlds that are neither too nasty nor not sufficiently nasty to actually put the pressure on you? So it's like you want to put the pressure to build up the capacities,
Yes,
but also not make it so challenging that they can't develop. And so there's like the range.
Yes. Yes. I mean, we have to distinguish two things. I think the world still needs a lot of structure for this capacity to evolve, because if it doesn't have the structure, you will not get introspection. As I say, you might get bacteria, protobacteria that can handle the combinatorics of chemistry, and that they will just process some metabolic substances, and that's all that happens. And there's no more than happens. There's no structure of the space. Concept of time is just a very, very minimal and very, very inaccurate. And that's perhaps all. And that's perfectly thinkable. We can imagine worlds in which this happens. Imagine even a world like even evolution processes that haven't got that far. Think of Europa. There is this hypothesis that Europa might harbor simple life. If that's the case, it might have evolved independently from Earth. Not necessarily, this is not necessarily true, by the way. It could be that we all come from a single, I wouldn't say panspermia, but one single cloud of amino acids and chemical history. But still, it might not evolve beyond a certain point. But you can imagine worlds which have a nastier physics, where still you can get to the level of bacteria.
But it has to be not so nasty that multi-step sequences and plans are impossible, where it actually pays off to try to predict into the future, try to model more advanced contingencies rather than just handling things with well-honed reactive dispositions. So just
Absolutely. I mean, it's clear that if you come up with some random cellular automaton, you don't get very far in terms of evolution.
So it has to be challenging enough, difficult enough that you need to plan, but not so difficult that planning is impossible.
Yes. For introspection, you need more than that. For introspection, you really need to be able to say, I mean, if you look, for example, at elephants are pretty intelligent. I mean, the intelligence of elephants and ravens are estimated to be intelligent as a 7-year-old child. Not sure this is a good comparison because I don't think it's really match one-to-one. But the point is that these animals can live and plan and so on, but they still cannot plan far enough to say create a calendar or create a complex society and things like that. You could imagine that they could do that. Elephants' trunks are pretty mobile and pretty versatile as a handling device, but you need this extra ability to plan beyond the immediate needs to get something like human society. And I really find it fascinating that the early high cultures, at least what we think are the early high cultures, say Egypt, one of the big achievements is the calendar. So they plan, okay, we know that the Sirius appears at this time in this location, and therefore we know soon the flooding of the Nile will start. And with this discovery, you suddenly think, okay, let's count the days. Let's see whether we can find some regularity by which we can predict when the Nile is coming to the Nile floods are beginning, so we can plan and put resources in place. And now you have a prediction that's not anymore a couple of months ahead. A prediction can be hundreds of years ahead if you have a good calendar. Perhaps not thousands of years, but 10, 20, 100 years, it's quite possible. And suddenly you have a phase transition in predictability. Or you get things like, it's much maligned today, religion, but in fact, religion.
Not just months, but years. Like in one of our conversations recently, I don't think we recorded, but you mentioned like building a cathedral. Like it's a regime where cathedral building makes sense. Like,
exactly. You create what the physicists would call a force field or a field that creates a protostructure that is then filled with whatever content is there. Well, the way to look at it, one way I like to look at this is like a crystal. If I give you, I have this picture where I give you a box, it's empty. And I tell you this box already contains structure of crystals, right? So if you take a two-dimensional confined space and you pack oranges in the space, they will assume a hexagonal grid. In fact, if you ask what regular grids can you create, regular lattices can you create in 2D, there are only 14 you can create. They are implicit. Nobody created them. Nobody made them, but they're implicit. There are only 14 ways you can arrange molecules or atoms in a way so that it doesn't have to be atoms. It could, the symmetry could be more complicated than that. There are only 14 ways to do that. And the interesting aspect about that, this is implicit, but as you very correctly said, you need to create the framework for that.
Don't want to derail us, but it keeps coming up. So do you think with like the dinosaurs and that long period of not needing to do anything like this, was it, to what degree was it like they had such exquisitely well-honed body plans that like the intelligence of and just the power of that was enough, and they didn't need to, or like I wonder why they got stuck. Was it just like a because
there was no need, as you say, right? I mean, you have to, I can give you a game that's quite flexible, and you never think of doing certain things with that game. I don't know. I mean, you can take a Lego. Now today, Lego does a lot of things, right? When I was a kid, Lego was just to build buildings. Typically, that's what you build. And when I was a kid, I built actually a vending machine. It was not a very complex vending machine. You could only sell once, but it would sell. You would put money in, and it would push out something, and it would actually throw out the money if the money was not of the right kind. It had a magnet inside, and so it would only accept money of a certain size, and if it was not magnetic. If it was magnetic, it would be pulled out. If it was too large, it would be pulled out, and so on. So what I'm saying is, this was something that people didn't used to do, and I toyed around with it. So I built that, and now today everybody does really, really complex things with Lego. Right, so I remember this was a transition when they started introducing Mindstorms and more sophisticated ways of what you could do with Lego, and this completely changed the game plan. Now the question is, was there any pressure for that? Maybe there was. Maybe the company had to develop new markets, or somebody just had that idea, and that idea just got consolidated. I don't think it's easy to distinguish, to be honest. I do think that if you create stress onto an evolutionary process or a learning process, if you create stress, the likelihood is higher that you will find such things. That, yes. So that's what stress does. Stress makes it, I wouldn't say easier. What stress does, it creates an advantage for risky exploration. When there's no stress, risky exploration is disadvantaged and will be swallowed by the success of exploitation. And I think that's what happens, right? So because exploration is usually expensive, you have to pay. You pay exploration tax. You pay lost resources, lost time, lost population that is actually lost in exploration. Of course, when you win, you can win very, very big. But this is something that's usually not viable if there are many resources that can be exploited. So unless you have an incentive to, reward exploration, and human society today does that because we get funding for research. Not as much as we researchers always like. Researchers always want more, but that's not the point. Modern societies have understood that the research tax or the exploration tax is worth paying, because it puts us in a position of being ready for unexpected events, for example.
Two analogies that come to mind. I don't know how well they fit. One is potentially like stress sensitive, variable mutation proneness areas of the genome potentially, and like maybe doing like a higher temperature search on the fitness landscape. It's at your peril, but we got to figure out something. It's time to what do they say? Roll the hard six. But then the other that's coming to mind is like something even like a life history strategy of like a more exploratory type personality, maybe of like stressors at different points in life, saying like, hey, this is a harsh world you're in. Maybe it's time to go big or go home. What you're going to do doesn't seem like it's working anyways. Go explore. Sort of like, and then some psychopathology potential and promise. So sometimes forms of like creative discovery and psychopathology maybe having kind of a twin birth from that exploration in the face of challenge.
That may be. I mean, we do know that probably if you talk about psychopathology as a phenomenon, this is an advantage, for example, in cases of war. It's an advantage in cases of keeping cool under pressure, and not melting away. And exploration is I do agree with your view. It can be character trait. I also think there is a cost that's not just the exploration cost, it's also a cost of integrating the new information to what you know. So when you explore, your problem is not only finding the new spots, but actually being able to do something with what you found. Because if you can't do that, if you either you as an individual can't absorb it, or you can't make your society absorb it, it's useless. So my favorite example is actually that the Greeks could have essentially the steam engine, or actually steam train. They had all the ingredients in place. Heron of Alexandria already had the steam engine as a toy. Corinth had rail tracks essentially to cover the isthmus of Corinth, so carrying goods from one side, from the sea at one side of the isthmus. Sorry, I don't manage to pronounce it properly. To the other side of it.
You're talking to a fellow reader here, so I can't help you with pronouncing that word. I know what you're talking about. Isthmus, I don't know how you say it.
I would have to look up the pronunciation. Anyway, so the point is, they had the rail tracks, they had the steam engine in different locations, but there was not the societal environment there to support that. When the steam engine was rediscovered, or basically by Denis Papin, in I think the 17th century, it was just, again, a phenomenon. It was not a toy anymore. It was already a scientific discovery. Then 100 years later, it became an engine. And a few, 50 years later, 30 years later, I'm not sure, because a couple of decades later, in any case, it became a moving steam engine. So you had a rail track and you put a moving steam engine, and suddenly, you have the Industrial Revolution. So this discovery basically came almost 2,000 years later. My other favorite examples, of course, differential calculus or integration, which Archimedes already had. Archimedes already knew how to do that, but it had to come together with the discovery of analytical geometry and other tools to be viable, to be generalizable, to manageable. Perhaps algebra was needed. There was no algebra at the time of Archimedes. So the technique of algebra suddenly made things possible. And I do think when people talk about impact and they talk about there's this discovery and a publication, and then we have to make a product off of that. That's nonsense. To make a product, you usually need 4 or 5 important discoveries that have to come together. And then you can hone them and turn them into a product. But usually it's not the one single phenomenon that can be turned into a product. Usually you need several things to appear at once. The internet is a nice example. you need the need of a decentralized network, you need the concept of layers of transport, you need computers, and you need many of them to make it viable, right? Before you have a computer in every home, there is no internet. You can have two computers talking to each other. That you can have, but this is not internet. The internet as a phenomenon becomes interesting when you have a lot of computers at different locations. Then you have the drive, like the actual web was a very simple idea. They had CERN and they wanted to have a library. They had this library, but CERN is huge. They decided, oh, why do I have always to walk there to find the books? Can't I just read it through these lines of connection? And suddenly there's a question how to organize literature in a way that is accessible remotely. And lo and behold, computers everywhere, the network technology, the network transport protocols, the need for distributed knowledge, cryptography to be able to do, for example, payment schemes. All this comes together to make the internet a commercially viable entity. Each of them per se is a brilliant step, but only in combination you can actually make it work.
So two things that are coming to mind, and I don't know if the connections will, well, the first connection I think will work, I don't know about the second. So the first one that's coming to mind is the analogy you were drawing earlier with the longbowman, and how basically there's a couple different underlying requisite technologies that would be needed for to realize it. And then once you have it, you're getting this virtuous cycle of the positive feedback of the demand and the supply kind of bootstrapping themselves into existence, where you can refine your skill at shooting it. And so then you have needs for it. And so then once you get, like, you're talking about, like, kind of coming back to the internet, like, if you have like a broad enough base of people who want it, well, then it pays off to begin supplying it. But if there's only just one person, it doesn't pay for you to specialize. There's a kind of scale that you need for that specialization to be a viable strategy. But then if you're dependent on just like, but having like in general, like a general craft of longbow makers, that would attract more people into that craft, into that art. And so they kind of, it seems like they're bootstrapping themselves. So I think that analogy works, but the other one I'm wondering is related to what you were saying earlier in terms of as part of a bootstrapping process, sometimes you'll get excessive, this may not relate, but entanglements or dependencies of a way that makes things stuck and unevolvable. And that sometimes when you raise the temperature, it can break things down and make it more modular and give you more combinatorics. I don't know if that's relevant right now. I feel like it is, but I'm not exactly sure how. But that kind of ability to reconfigure things.
That is another point of very big interest, modularity. I agree. And it's quite a different one, I think. It's not so much, I don't know. I mean, now speculating, I'm running with it. I think that is quite a different one from the need of having the right substrate at this stage. So to finalize a point on the substrate, and then I'll move to the modularity, which I think is a very good one. There's a very nice example of how things can fail, even if the technology, for example, is there. So in Japan, for example, the Japanese learned the art of gun making, I think from the Portuguese, possibly, if I remember correctly. And let's not forget that the Chinese were the ones who invented the gunpowder, right? But they didn't actually turn it into a proper weapons technology, except for some missiles, which were not as effective. The Japanese actually were, in their time, the best gun makers. They made guns at a much higher quality than the Europeans. However, for some reason, and a social reason, they actually banished them. So in other words, they unevolved their technical achievements. And it was a social reason. It was basically,
or like, was it considered like against the code of the samurai, or?
I think what happened actually was that if you're a samurai, you learn your whole life to how to fight. And that is your skill. And that's what distinguishes you from some random farmer. With a gun, anyone can shoot you. And that means that anyone can now fight. So to make that distinction, still keep that distinction viable. That's what I heard. Maybe an urban legend. I will not claim any veracity. But to be honest, it might actually, it sounds plausible that it would be, no, we don't want unskilled people to be able to fight skilled ones. We want the skill to be valued. And
that's like protecting a guild almost, but and also imagine an identity, like an existential stance, like
exactly. Protecting a guild is probably a very good comparison. So you can have this, and I do think that this phenomenon does happen. Or it could be that it's not ready. In this case, in Japan, it was not that it was not ready, but there are things like the societies are not ready for a particular technology. As for modularity, that's a very interesting one. I personally think it's quite a separate.
Quick, so there might be, so there's some individual who's, I guess, maybe pushed on a more exploratory or shamanic or just creative path of some kind, but there has to be a social context, and that person has to be ready to make sense of what they find, and there has to be a community that could support it and integrate it. Otherwise, the exploration, whatever, the fruit will die in the vine, like it just won't be taken up into any kind of process.
Exactly. In fact, we definitely know this from Archimedes. Archimedes actually complained in one of his letters to, I don't know whether it was Aristotle's or one of his friends. This is actually cited. I'm citing the Archimedes Codex, which is a book that I very much recommend if you're interested in the history of Archimedes' work. So this is a shame. It's not a plug for anything. I don't profit from that. I just like the book. And this is one thing that Archimedes complained about, that he had nobody that would actually understand what he's doing. And in that book, Archimedes Codex, the comment is something along the line saying it would take 1.5 centuries for people to emerge that would actually understand what Archimedes had in mind.
Nietzsche wrote some men are born posthumously. Nietzsche, I think maybe it's the beginning of Der Antichrist. He wrote like some men are born posthumously.
That's a good one. Oh. I like it. Well, we can assume that there are many people with Leonardo da Vinci, for example. It's very interesting. I don't think that his contemporaries understood everything he did, but they understood that he was onto something, right? So he clearly was not neglected. They understood, okay, we don't understand what he's doing, but it seems to be good. And I do think that with Archimedes, I do think also that I understood that it was good, but there was nobody close even to understanding what he was doing. With Leonardo, it was different. Things would be visible, would be imaginable, and then they reappeared, and people started looking. Oh yeah, he did that, but it was not totally off the slate. It was, so he was somewhat
illegible, but there was something about the generative process that was legible enough that people are like, there's something happening here that, like, yes, even though they're not like tracing like all the plans and dependencies, are like enough that there was support available. That like, was it like the Medicis or I forget, but like he would have patrons. He would have like some.
He got a lot of patrons. He got a lot of patrons, and the best patrons he actually got was, interestingly, as always, you're never a prophet in your own country, the King of France. I think it was Francois I. So he was actually his best patron in the end. He gave him actually castle.
What's the expression? No one's a prophet in their own country.
Yeah, I think something like that. I mean, he was well regarded, but the problem is for example, people commissioned paintings and he would not finish them, and they would bug him about finishing them. And then he obviously either lost his nerves or lost the inspiration or lost the motivation. Or anyway, many paintings he left unfinished. And interestingly enough, it was Francois I that actually said, "Okay, I give you this castle," and legend said that he held the dying Leonardo in his arms. Whether it's true, it's not really relevant. The point is that people believe that it could have been true, and it goes to show that people understood that Leonardo was something other. And I think
more legible to his contemporaries.
More legible, and I think also the Renaissance were more ready to accept extravagance. Was more ready to do so. There was a sense of adventure in the air. And I do believe that one of the humanists, I forgot whether it was Reuchlin or Erasmus, he actually said that as a pleasure to live, right? And he meant it was great time in terms of things move, stuff happens. So there was a big optimism in the air, despite the really nasty political environment. The political environment was very unpleasant, very, very, very nasty wars, very nasty sack of Rome and things like that. Despite that, there was a sense of general optimism in the air. And no worries. And I do think that we have times where there is not the sense of optimism in the air, where things are kind of rather dour, and yeah, people still invent stuff, certainly, but there's not the sense of infinite possibility, infinite potential in the air. And we say that comes in waves. It comes and goes. There was a little bit of this downwards trajectory after the moon landings, for example, where, okay, the moon landings were an unbelievable achievement. And afterwards, okay, what now? You already did the biggest and most difficult thing you could. And there was a time, the 70s essentially was a time of a little bit of, low motivation time in research. There were some, of course, good researchers and good research.
But I don't know if this, I might be taking this too far, but you're, I've tended to be more of like, in terms of like the roles of contingency and evolution versus like convergence, like I've tended to be like feeling more like convergence will win. But from like the way you're describing like these like windows of opportunity where things are, where the right pressures are there, but also the right affordances, pressures constrained but not too constrained in the right ways. The evolutionary process is now seeming very, very contingent to me. In terms of like you roll this dice, I could see it going very differently in different circumstances in some ways.
It's a mixture. I mean, nobody claims that evolution has just one. There is a lot of convergence, right? If you look at eyes, for example, we see octopus eye and human eye. This classic example. Look macroanatomically very similar, very, very similar. Microanatomically totally different, completely different, but macroanatomically they look the same, almost not the same, but very, very similar. So there's convergence here. If you look at the different types of sea animals, so dolphins have a fish-like body plan or body structure, although they have a genetically completely different history. Evolutionary history is completely different. They pass through land animals phase. So there is certainly convergence, right? I will never, you will never see You say that, you will bats have wings, etc. So you can find convergence in many aspects. But on the other hand, there are lots of things that are just so, and you say, okay, how did bats discover the auditory sense as sense of vision? It's actually, they use it as a visual modality. That's not necessarily the case. And you find electric eels. I'm not sure how big the family of animals are that actually use the electrical sense to sense in muddy waters. Birds have a sense of, they are able to see the magnetic field of the earth. They can see it somehow. Again, the question is that contingent? Is that lucky? Is that convergence? That is not so easy to answer.
The answer is yes.
In the case of birds?
Or just you laid all those options. Is it this or this? Yes.
Okay, yeah. This or the, exactly. So the question that we have to ask is really, how much of that is convergent and how much of that is not? How much of that is just a lucky break? And to be honest, nobody can answer that for the case of, I mean, we don't even know it for life, right? Because life, we have just one sample. That's not enough to do statistics. I am citing Ilya Nemenma here. I think he was quoted saying, 0 is nothing, 1 is nothing, 2 is the statistics. I love this saying because it makes clear what, if you have 2 that fall into the same class, you know something, right? If you have just one event, you don't know anything. So unless we find some other emergence of life, we cannot say anything about how likely is it to evolve to at all. Now, let's assume we find primitive life. We still don't know, is intelligent life, and especially intelligent introspective life, say humans, but I'm not thinking of humans, I'm thinking of something that can reflect about the emergence of the universe and the emergence of the whole thing itself. Is that something that will re-evolve, or is it just lucky that we got there? And to be honest, if I look at history of evolution, it's not clear that it's obligatory. It's not clear that it had to be this way. You could have got to a Homo erectus and stay there for a very long time. And that's it. Nothing further. And that's fine. I mean, many animals can reach that level, right? Animals can use tools, animals can form complex societies, animals can, they reach quite a level of complexity, and that's it. And we're there, and we stay there. And no further. I don't know how old elephants are, but I think it would be worth checking out how old the line of elephants is. I venture to say it's quite old, and they have everything that they could use tools. They are very intelligent. They have good memory. They get very old, so they can do cultural teaching. Octopuses, for example, have a big disadvantage. They don't get very old. So they live 2 or 3 years and then they die. Imagine they could get old, whether they could do some cultural teaching. Okay, they have a disadvantage. They can't do fire.
I'm wondering also if being underwater, it's a little bit more like earlier you were saying with like things floating around makes it
difficult, yes. And there's another thing that we underestimate, and
even though they're not clouds, things are cloudier in their world in terms of their
Exactly. And what you also don't have underwater is clear momentum. So there are very few animals that live underwater that have a concept of momentum. One example is Toxotes jaculatrix, which is a fish that shoots down insects from leaves. And they do that by firing a stream of water.
They spit it?
They spit it.
Okay.
They spit it. They take water in and shoot it. And they must have a concept of momentum, obviously. And they must have a concept of how to recalculate the refraction of light, because they see the animal on the branch, and they have to recalculate the angle, and they have to learn it. They do learn this. So it's a skill that is not just inborn. Of course, they have an inborn instinct to do that, but they have to learn how to do that properly. But apart from that, in the water, the concept of momentum is not very good, because momentum is simply not well conserved. And if you go to air, concept of momentum becomes this thing that's worth keeping track of. And humans seem to be pretty good at that, especially because they have, and that seems to be the case, that humans are by far the best primates in throwing. They can throw further and with more accuracy. And that means that not only is our body able to do that, of course it supports that, but of course the brain needs to be able to process momentum. I mean, there are many speculations why the brain is so big. There may be many reasons for that. But again, one more reason that adds up to drive complex brain that can handle difficult dynamics.
And I'm imagining maybe some sort of co-selection for brain and body and other bootstrapping, where it's like bodies that can have finer control and can interact where their own momentum and interacting with other objects with momentum and creating momentums becomes more sophisticated. But then you have the pressure for a more sophisticated controller, and then you have pressures for, and so then now it's useful to have bodies, and then that can do such things, and then pressure for complexification of the nervous system, going back and forth there maybe. Didn't someone suggested that about around the Cambrian, maybe like something about like once the Hox genes were in place or something like that, like the body plans, like then like all of a sudden like this putting a pressure for certain types of nervous system complexity because of these more capable body plans. And then
there is this idea that Andrew Parker put forward in his book, In the Blink of an Eye. And what he suggests is that maybe it's not just him, I have this idea from the source, that the discovery of organized photoreceptors that can essentially see objects far away and resolve them well creates a huge evolutionary pressure. And this may have triggered the Cambrian explosion. Now, as we say, maybe there are many things that came into place to do that, but definitely having a complete rewiring of your niche by looking at things that are further away, so making things in your neighborhood that were far away before, can change the whole game, right? So before that, you could interact only with stuff that's close to you. You could eat stuff that's close to you. You could not plan long distance movement. There was no point in planning long distance movement. All you had is some kind of chemical whiff of something that might be edible. But once you
electrical sense, but that can only reach out so far. Isn't that like a inverse square if it would be, but like it would like fall off very quickly in terms of what it could resolve.
And it's also low quality.
And low quality.
You don't get much information from this. You get a bit of information, but it's low quality. It's not helping a lot. It's not fast. It's not accurate, and it decays with time very quickly. So it's low quality.
Poor resolution. Yeah.
Poor resolution, poor relevant information, poor quality information. And once you have vision, this changes the game completely. Suddenly you can see things very accurately with high fidelity. Moving fast suddenly becomes relevant. Moving in a consistent direction becomes relevant. Defending from attacks becomes relevant.
And now it pays to plan.
Exactly. Now it pays to plan, both in attack as well as in defense. That's exactly the point. Now it pays to plan. This change of niche makes everybody your neighbor everybody suddenly becomes your neighbor in a circle of say 10, 20 meters underwater. And now it pays to plan, it pays to be faster, it pays to be stronger, it pays to be more accurate, it pays to be more sensitive. Total game changer. Olfaction is a very, very dirty sense, a very interesting sense in some sense, because it's much older, and it's so there's so little you can. It's so combinatoric, if you like. The olfaction is very combinatoric as a sense. There's very little structure in this sense. But once vision is completely different game, suddenly you have a completely separate way to do that. And now we are back to the topic of modularity. Suddenly modularity becomes important. What does modularity mean? Modularity means that I can concentrate on one thing, fixing that thing, and more or less ignore what happens in the other parameters.
So I'm thinking of earlier you were pointing me to this work on bottlenecks as potentially like allowing you to pick out at these choke points, basically like control like order parameters of the system. And so like, I guess what I'm wondering is like if these then could somehow be in relation to this like sparse structure, and that it can respond to it and react, like, so you can pick out a thing and now your whole system can be organized based on that controllable factor there and your relation to it. But if such things don't exist because everything's floating around, and if you can't perceive them, there's no point in, like, it's yeah, that would not be an option. That was a little garbled, but I don't know if that, yeah.
Absolutely. You now, if everything's mixed up, your problem is that you can't change anything without changing other things. And now when the system gets beyond a certain complexity, any evolutionary process, or even not an evolutionary process, any process needs a huge complexity to bookkeep what you have to change at the same time. That's a problem. Now, to some extent, nature can do that. Evolution is quite flexible. But in my opinion, there's a lot of support for evolution in the moment that you say, look, you can change this, you can control this without affecting something else. Whenever you can do that, it reduces complexity by a lot, because you now don't need to have to trace information all over the place. You can concentrate on the information here is relevant to this thing, and that can be directly fixed, and the complexity of that is much, much lower. And keeping track of everything that
something like the smell worlds, or if it's too mixed up, complexity beyond a certain amount, like not only might it not actually be like doing the mapping onto events, onto some sort of sparse causal structure, might just not be a tractable problem. Like, so you need like the sensory acuity has to be such that. So I guess one thing that's interesting. Okay, so a few things that are coming to mind would be, one is, so three things. One is something earlier you said of with relation to empowerment, both like you having these options, but also knowing that you do as being part of it. And that's important, that being a crucial part. The other thing that are coming to mind is in the paper on empowerment and AI, in terms of like the relationship of one agent to another. If you change the sensory interface, this then changes the way, like, let's say you're trying to maximize the empowerment of another agent you're interacting with, what that will end up being would be very different if you have, if you're depending on different sensor systems. Like this is creating,
it's hard to know how different it will be. Right?
And the last thing was also effector system. So I'm like, how important are effectors of what degree of, like, how multiple, so how much does it matter if we have like an elephant's trunk or an octopus's arm versus a hand with a power grip versus a beak? Like, how much does this like place? Anyway, so those are the three things that are running through my mind.
It's very clear that different affordances will give you different preferred behaviors. I mean, people buy different cars because they want a certain driving experience. It's very clear that the people, even, I mean, the designers of cars even know that people expect the closing door of a car to sound in a certain way. So when you buy a certain car and you close the door, the sound is being designed to sound like, you know, this is a nice, expensive car and not a cheap tin box. Maybe if you wouldn't design it and you would close it and it's a perfectly fine car, it would sound like a tin box. And so I'm not surprised that people design it like that, because it creates the mind. There's one story that I heard, which was very funny, that in Latin America, when they sell, when you have air conditioners there, they are usually very loud. And you think, why is this so loud? I can't sleep with all that noise. What turns out is that the response is people don't buy silent ACs, the silent air conditioners, because they don't believe they do their job. So when the air conditioner doesn't make a noise, people feel it doesn't actually do the job. In other words, this is feedback. Yes, this is working. Right?
Kind of handshake with the world, that satisfying flick that you can register. Yes. You trust that the signal is received, and also you trust in the structure, even like if it has this like resonance, that's not, if it's not this like tinny thin thing, like it's like that is a solid object. That
exactly. And of course, we all know this effect from keyboards. Good keyboard and bad keyboard is very clear. The good keyboards give you this counter force. And in fact, there are some people who actually use this phenomenon to create intrinsic motivation. So there's a group in Japan who uses a term called tegotai as counter. It's basically like resistance. It means resistance. And they use this term for intrinsic motivations for robots that respond to, okay, there's a counter, okay, there's something that pushes against. That's a good thing. That's what I want, rather than something that's just floppy and doesn't react. So it looks for a counter force as the state it looks for to determine what behavior it should pick.
So if there's something's giving you a counter force, you both know there's something there, and now you also have a certain kinematics and momentum to work with around that thing.
Yes, it's more than kinematics, it's dynamics. You feel the force.
Feel the force, and it's giving you a feedback. As you push, you're getting it back, and so that handshake is there, and then you actually have the ability for control. That's, now you have a closed loop of.
Exactly. Feel the force loop, right? So this is not an empty word. It's actually real, and I do think that, for example, people who play an instrument, they use it all the time. If you say play the piano, I mean, there are other instruments, but I know piano best. So if you have a piano and you go to a different instrument that reacts differently, weaker or softer or something, and this is bothering you. You feel like, oh, it doesn't give me proper feedback. It doesn't give me the right level of resistance. You have to adapt to that. This design of this is quite important. In fact, more expensive instruments do have a more refined response. You expect this response.
It's interesting. That even seems to play out like socio-emotionally with people. in terms of like our ability to trust others. Like there's a certain like for the person, their own integrity, there's like, if you push on them, there's a certain pushback you get. And now you're like, there's like a trust that there's a person there you're working with and can model and coordinate with. And like, if they don't give you that pushback, it's almost like unsettling. It's like
Yes. Yes.
it's it's part of like the uncanniness of like Stepford Wives, like that sort of like, it's like
excellent example. Yes. 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 This is what Uncanny Valley probably is about, that the counterpart doesn't react in an appropriate way. We are very good at reading other people. I mean, this is a survival strategy. So even if people don't say anything or don't even nod, usually we're pretty good at reading what they think, or at least whether they absorbed what we said. But it's of course considered polite to respond. And that's what the Japanese have with the word hi, when they say hi. That's not a yes. It means I have heard you. And that's polite.
The ping back. It's like
the ping back, yes. Yes. And you have to give the
packet received.
Packet received, exactly. Right? That's a minimum that you should be doing to clarify that it has arrived, and in one way or the other. Yeah, and I do think that this response is something that I really like, the Tegotai principle, also as a principle for intelligence, emergence of intelligence or intrinsic motivation, because I think it's very fundamental that we expect this kind of reaction. And when that doesn't happen, as you said, that's uncanny. That's uncanny. Yeah, this is really, we really don't like that. Actually, the movie, this movie AI by Spielberg has this really unpleasant scene where the robots are being tortured. The detestable scene. I mean, it's well done. You get really upset, so it works. But where the robots actually don't fight back, they don't do actually any, and that's really unsettling. You feel like there needs to be a reaction. Something needs to happen. And that is really yeah, so I do agree with you.
So like the input of this rattle, and it's like there's like, as it pushes on it, it'll have a certain whip back.
Yes.
And it is and like a certain substantiality to it, but so in this concept, like, is pliability part of it, or is it mostly focused on like the contact? So like, so for instance, like there'll be a difference between encountering something where, well, I mean, regardless, I should register. This is something that I can rest on. This is something I, to maneuver around. But also, like, let's say this is like an indomitable like wall, versus like this is something I can like, that like also is pliable. Like,
this is a good question, right? I mean, it depends what you want to do in the end of the day, right? So if a wall doesn't move and I want it to move because I want to pass, or I want to go to the other room or something.
Sometimes you might want an unmovable wall, though. Like,
sorry.
So depending on what you're doing, sometimes an unmovable thing is exactly what's needed.
Exactly, right. Yeah. So here in the language of empowerment, it would depend on what your sensor's phobia is actually concentrated upon. What's the focus of what you're doing, right? What are you paying attention to? So if you want to get a stable basis to, for example, to drill a hole or something like that, then yes, you want a fixed, well-established wall. If you want to move to the other room, that's not what you want. You want to be able to move that wall. I think the Tegotai principle gets interesting if you want feedback, you want this to move, but you want to know that you are actually moving it. So you don't want things that just react weightlessly. That's usually something we don't like. There are exceptions. I saw this really funny YouTube video where there was an astronaut who just basically came from space, and then he wanted to demonstrate something and took a pen, expected it to hang in the air, and fell down. And then, oh, okay, I have to pick that up. He forgot about gravity, right? So he was clearly used to a very compliant world, to a world where there was no gravity and where a pen essentially would just be compliant and staying where it is. So you can learn the compliance. It's like when you take a different instrument, you learn that it's much more compliant than the other one that you're working with. That's learnable.
But some sort of ping back, and I'm thinking of like the Wii video game controller or things like this, where like they introduced like or just like incorporating like a vibrational haptic part to it.
Yes.
So it's like you might have like a lightsaber or something, and you swing it, but you're not actually going to get it making contact with something else. But at the very least, some sort of, I gave the command, I'm predicting this, and now the vibration's coming in, and now I'm predicting at my sensors, conditioned on my actions.
Yes.
Give the sensor something to have this closure that is the sign of purchase.
Exactly. And you're missing that. And if you look at good simulators do that. You sit there and drive a car, and then the simulator goes, changes the direction, so you feel the acceleration as gravity. And this really improves immersion. It really improves immersion. Otherwise, what happens, you have to fill in the blanks. And when you have to fill in the blanks, your brain works harder, and then it's not as real. It still works, but it's not as real. You can play, driving simulator without having to have a seat that pushes you in the different directions. It's feasible, and people react to that, but it's not quite as good as, of course, if you have the full immersion, because then all the sensors are actually telling the same story. They all agree on the story that tell your brain.
Is this like to kind of come back to the sociomotive version? Like I'm wondering, like excessive politeness, even like some sort of like, if you're not getting a certain sort of
I see.
Like the sense of reality of others to each other, and actually like, I guess a presence, I guess, would be the construct, and like from like you're saying immersion, and then virtual reality, they'll talk about presence, and they'll talk about like in like transpersonal psychology about like presence and co-presence. I'm wondering if that language being the same is not a coincidence at all. It's actually like what it is for something to be real to you, and to be meaningful, to matter, and a certain sort of sense of possibility, and both controllability and incontrollability. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, possibility and impossibility. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we know from empowerment well. I mentioned empowerment here, not to, just we talked enough about that, but I mentioned as a principle that it gives you structure in the world, as opposed to everything is equivalent. You say, no, not everything is created equal. Not all the spots in the world are created equal. Some of them are more equal than others. Well, not equal, some unequal. And when they are all equal, there's a problem, right? Omnipotence is a very boring state of things, right? So if you had an omnipotent being, in fact, the old Greek gods had this problem, so they incarnated themselves in avatars. That's why the Iliad is full of that. It's actually very interesting thinking. The gods simply fight with the humans because that's much more interesting. If they fought each other, it would be just a very boring, very no stakes, if you like. Yeah, it's a bit like when you have these movies where you have two powerful characters, especially if the hero is too powerful. It's too boring. You need the hero to be basically coerced to push against something. Otherwise, there's no story.
Is that? I wonder if this is part of like why I mean, there's other explanations for this, but part of why like some of the association of like power and corruption is like if you have this asymmetry with respect to others and then they're not actually real to you, uh, then all of a sudden your care for them would go down. You don't need like they're not of like calling themselves to you as something to model, to be made real. And then you bulldoze more, and then it's like and maybe like grab more power, and then people are less real, and then
And you also have the excellent observation. You essentially lose the sense of what are the limits of what you're doing, because you don't get the limits. You're looking for the limits. And essentially, it's like being a big kid, being big baby that actually looks for the limits of ability, that looks for how far can I go? What's the limit of what I can do? This structures my world. If there's no limit, the world is a horrible place in a way. And in fact, if you look at Roman emperors that had this infinite power, or thought they had it, they were really poor people in a way that they were looking for the things that would say, stop, don't go here, enough, we got to the limit. And that's why you want, especially for people with such incredible power, you want wisdom. And the reason for that is, what is this wisdom doing? It's nothing else but actually knowing, having predictors for where the limits are. Because of course there are limits, they just didn't see them. Right, so Nero and Caligula, if we believe that they were really as crazy as their contemporaries claim, they simply didn't see the limits of their power. Of course, there were limits to the empire, what the empire could do at that time. The empire was very powerful. This was why they never hit the limits. They didn't see where things would start to fail or where the dangers are. Capable emperors did see that. They saw, okay, the empire stretched too far out. For example, I don't know, Hadrian decided, okay, let's just retreat a bit because it's too big. We can't manage that. Let's build a wall in Caledonia, basically Hadrian's wall. And this is kind of saying, okay, this is how far we can go. And they understood the limits. So in a way, what they were looking for is limits, and the smart emperors could see them. They could model them ahead. They didn't actually hit them because they were smarter than that, but they could model them. They had a model of the limits. If you're less smart, you may not model them, but may experience them. But if you don't experience them and you can't see them, then you're in trouble.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the reports are, what people claimed in terms of the excesses and that search for limits. I think, we've all in different degrees, like encountered it in work situations, or like, I'm thinking in literature, like, this is literature, but like Heart of Darkness, like Kurtz in the jungle, or like making himself into a demigod, or then like more recently in Westworld, like the people like going black hat and William is that character. Basically, he's actually experiencing this intense distress because like he's not finding any limits, and he's like weary and bored of the world and just escalating the game until he can find something to push back.
Yes. Yes, I haven't seen the series, I'm afraid, but I can imagine what you're talking about. So yes, I completely agree. I do think actually that's one reason why you actually want a leader, for example, in politics, who has failed in the past, has at least one or two failures in the past, because that teaches him or her things can go wrong, and they have a model of how things can go wrong. And then they as we said, you either get the experience or you have a model, or you have both, right? Experience and build a model from that, how things can go wrong. So you want actually normally people who know how things can go wrong, or as my prof used to say, he said, what is a software engineer? Is somebody who has seen 3 or 4 projects fail. right? I
Now
mean,
you're a
this is
proper engineer. Now you're a proper engineer.
yeah. I mean, I do think that seeing projects fail, especially software engineering, right? A little program or something, you can make them successful, make them work. That's all good. But in an ill-defined topic, or much less defined topic like software engineering, where it's much harder to actually pin down what is the right thing to do, having this idea how projects can fail and how failures look like is what gives meaning to good practice. If I just tell you this is good practice, you believe me or don't believe me, you do it with half heart. But if I tell you, if you don't do that, this and this and this is going to happen, that makes sense. Then you, okay, it creates a narrative, or it creates what I like to say tangential space of the failure modes of what you're doing.
And if you don't seek out those limits, you're both not going to know the areas of state space to where to avoid, but also you're going to be leaving on the table moves, options that someone who actually did discover those limits and was working more to the extent of them, they're getting more marginal value from the world they're in. And it's like that. So it should be it should be, I guess, any system should be trying to seek out these limits. So to what extent is this heuristically realized, and to what extent is this realized? Okay. So to what extent would these be like evolutionary priors in terms of like basic parameters? To what extent is this like a learned implicit heuristic? And then what's the advantage of like, I guess, explicitly modeling this idea of limits? Like, so it's like you can, yeah, now I'm wondering like the extent to which like this is actually built into like the logic of like value signals and like nervous systems. Like, or is that just it's going to be a reliably learnable thing that an agent will figure this out and you don't need to do that? I'm not.
I mean, empowerment, for example, does it to a certain degree, okay, automatically. It's part of the model of empowerment that you essentially give higher weight to potential action sequences that evoke boundary states, that evoke states that are at the boundary of what you can do at a given time. So that this is just happens in the computation of empowerment. Now, I don't know whether it's linked, right? But it is an interesting coincidence. If it's not linked, it's an interesting coincidence that it does the same thing. It has the same type of property. That being said, I don't think that in general, when you sit in a niche, you're happy in your niche, and you live your comfortable life, then you just kick out and they start de-evolving perhaps even your understanding about the tangential space. You forget about the limits. You don't need the limits. You have the right behavior, and that's good enough for you. You stick in your niche and you stay there for millions of years. Okay, why change, right? You see that also in people where they say, we always have done it this way, right? And sometimes that's the right answer. Namely, always when the niche hasn't changed and is not in danger of changing. When the niche changes, you're in a better shape. No, so the search for limits is not always what you want, right? We talked about gods and crazy emperors, and crazy emperors and gods have one thing in common. Because it's unlimited what they can do, maybe also their drive to explore or the drive to find the limits is unlimited in a way. So in a way, and that's why children, for example, they look for the limits. They're actively searching the limits. But if you take, I don't know, a snail, I don't think it's looking for limits. Snail is just doing its thing, and it's doing its niche well, and that's good enough for it. There are many organisms that live in a niche, and they're fine with that. They don't push the limits, because pushing limits has a cost. Curiosity killed the cat, as I say, right? In an organism that lives in very unstable niches or a niche that can change or they're relatively complex, I would expect the organisms to actually push the limits. We can call that exploration. It's a bit more than exploration. It's pushing the limits or finding the limits is something that is, I think, important for organisms living in an unstable environment.
So I'm thinking octopi versus clams. So like the clam strategy is like, don't like create basically a situation where you don't need to encounter, it's you set route and filter, and you might even like wait for like I think it's actually like serotonin. You're like, this is a good patch. I'm going to set up shop here. I'm going to put down a stalk, build a shell. That's it. Not my state space is very simple, not very exploratory. I'm just going to filter things.
Exactly.
Like occasionally my tongue to knock things around or something, but just like, but if you're an octopus, that's
exactly right. So you really, your niche decides what is it that you want to do. And I do believe that there are these two phenomena, the erosion of the tangent space, where you actually lose the ability to explore it and you don't care about that either. And that can be good enough. For some types of niches, that's perfectly fine. Humans have a thing in their in modern society. This is, by the way, the opposite. What probably the biggest distinction between medieval and modern society. In modern society, it is seen as a virtue to create unstable environments that force people to, constantly be on the edge. If you look at the Middle Age, at medieval times, that's exactly the opposite of that. They wanted, you're in this niche, this is a good niche, and just behave like you should be in this niche, and you're good, and that's enough for you. And maybe that would have also gone on for a long time, except for two things, or essentially it's the same thing, namely the Black Death and the Mongolian invasions. But the Mongolian invasions brought the Black Death to Europe in a way. So maybe, this actually created a situation where suddenly people were not available to farm, and the farmers suddenly became much more valuable workforce. And so trade became more important. And when trade became more important, suddenly you get all this redistribution of activities, and you now have to maintain this network of trade. And things become much more complicated, and the world becomes much more volatile and interconnected. Well, my favorite example is, of course, the collapse of the late Bronze Age, in the sense that suddenly the whole trade routes which were established, everything runs fine, bronze can be generated, we're all happy people, more or less, not entirely, but things collapse. Suddenly you have to create tools with local goods. It's much harder to do because iron is much nastier to requires much higher temperatures to be formed. And now suddenly you are forced to develop all kinds of new technologies, new types of state formation, and new types of how to wage war, etc. So in other words, I would say if a society is not under pressure to change, it doesn't necessarily have this ideology to change. Of course, large societies tend to have this more likely because you have contact with other societies. But if you are an isolated society, unless there's some external stressor, you could just do your stuff.
So I'm kind of thinking of Japan again. Like they were somewhat isolated, and they were well optimized within that niche. Like, so, so they're on an island. They're strong and capable, but they didn't need to adopt the gun. They could keep Bushido going without the really updating with the guns. They could.
Yes.
They could keep being beautiful dinosaurs, and they didn't need to become wily mammals so much.
Yeah, they could afford to do that, and it worked for them. And if you look Papua New Guinea, same story, right?
Until it didn't. And it worked for them until it didn't.
Exactly. At some point, of course, the external world broke in. But Papua New Guinea is a good example too, right? You have this very mountainous country, very difficult to get from one valley to the other. And you find this huge variety of societies that just did their thing in their particular way. And they were very different from each other, including the languages.
And in the Middle Ages, like they built up, a fair amount of complexity. They had this good division of labor. Not these integrated solutions to the problems of life, and so they're trying to keep you on this right-hand path, this straight and narrow of their coordination manifold. And
yeah.
and it worked until it didn't. Like it worked until the Black Death came in, but then.
And then they had to modify it. China had the same problem, right? So China, it was so big and so powerful that there was no real threat. Once the Mongolian threat was eliminated, or basically disappeared, because the Mongolians just became part of China in a way with the Yuan dynasty. That's it, right? Suddenly, okay, we are good, and then you have this huge country that can just rest in itself and can do its things until, of course, as you say, you couldn't, because somebody.
I think Alan Watts might have said, "Nothing fails like success."
Who said that?
I think Alan Watts said this once.
Yeah. I have a slightly different formulation, but probably that's also not very original. But I couldn't find the original quote. Every successful system, or every successful being, carries the seed of its own destruction. And that is probably the reason, because you just forget about how does it look, how does failure look. You need to see failure. You need to understand how the failure modes look like. That is absolutely essential for long-term survival. If you have that code, doesn't mean that you have to fail. It doesn't mean that you need to keep failing. You just need to understand how failure looks like.
You need a taste of it.
You need to at least have a model of it.
You need to know the shape of it, and the rough shape of it.
Yeah, you need to know where it is. How does it look like? So I think modern militaries, as that are successful and work well, they constantly model for what are the failure modes. Success is well, I'm not saying easy. Success is not easy, but Sun Tzu, basically, if you take the thing, if you know yourself, but you don't know your opponent, then no, it's the order is, I think, this way. If you know your opponent but don't know yourself, you will lose a battle for each battle won. If you know yourself but not the opponent, you will win a battle for each battle lost. You need to know yourself and your opponent, and then you will win everything. Of course, it's probably not always true, but generally the statement is actually very deep. It says, knowing your opponent means, okay, you know how to solve a problem, you know how to do success, but if you don't know yourself, you don't know your motive of failure, if you like. That's my interpretation of that. Then you will fail. There will be always this point where you start failing. You need to understand where the failure modes sit. And if you have a good collective memory, it doesn't have to be you as an individual, it can be collective memory, can be memory of your nation, can be the memory or your genetic memory, can be your epigenetic memory, or even your individual memory. Like you failed at some point and you remember how the failure looked like, and then you can be, then you have a better chance of longer term survival.
It doesn't have to be you. Like it could be encoded in myth, or like you're saying, epigenetics. Like I'm thinking like some interesting things I've seen with even on the paternal line. Apparently, you can basically take some associations between like highly salient events that like pushed you to the edge, and particular odorants, and you can transmit this even along the paternal line. I don't know if this is like somehow biasing gamete selection or something, like how that mechanism works.
Okay.
But I mean, because the olfactory receptors are on every cell, maybe that's it, I don't know. But the but this sense of having that be part of the of mapping out the state space in which you're pursuing your policies, like that has to be there somehow. You have to either learn it or remember and then remember it. And either has to be from your own experience or from collective experience. But seems like that's potentially a lot of those. So like I was thinking, I've been thinking like a good amount about like narrative and myth as like helping to like entrain people into playable games. But this seems like another function, which is actually acting as a memory system, so that basically other, it's kind of like planning, let's, your hypotheses die in your stead. The other people who encountered a bad fate, you would code this into like the meta brain of the culture. And then you can get a read on where you're likely to go and not go, and you can experience this and discover those boundaries imaginatively, rather than
Absolutely.
like actually having to put yourself there.
Absolutely.
Touch the hot stove too many times.
Yes, that's exactly, I completely agree with you. That's the role of mythology. And people totally underestimate. I mean, religion has people always look at it through a very specific filter, which they forget the role of religion before the times of collective knowledge, or before the times of also when they say, oh, God watches you, or the gods watch you. What was the point of that? The point was very simple, that society would break apart if they don't. But the point is they didn't have CCTVs at that time. So they had to have some kind of projected CCTVs. There's something watching you, making sure that you're actually doing the right things. Of course, people wouldn't always, but they would do much more than if you would say, oh, nobody watches you, do what you want. And then you essentially get this is exactly what happens in chimpanzee societies. Chimpanzee societies are super brutal. They're extremely violent. The question is, it's no surprise. People say, oh, if chimpanzees would build a society, it would be, I say, no, they would not build a society. They can't scale it. Humans can scale it because they can agree on what's acceptable constraints and what are not. Not perfectly, and they do disagree, and different crystallization points of humans have different ways of organizing these constraints, and that's why we have different cultures and sometimes also religious wars, because they are essentially domain boundaries of different ways of organizing collective behavior. But essentially, this is what religion is about. It's about organizing. Okay, these are boundaries. You're told these are boundaries, and you should not test them out because they have been already tested. Somebody has done the job for you, essentially. And this is encoded then in things, okay, the gods get angry if you do this and so on. But the point is, it's not that the gods get angry, it's the fact that you or your descendants or your society will pay for it at some point downstream.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the particular account is like the specific causal unfolding. The point is that your attention and behavior is directed appropriately. And like it's like you could rely on things like grandparents and like local storytellers, but it seems like if you can get like a broader mythos, it's a more powerful learning system, and you're getting something more like unlimited heredity, or like you're getting like a proper evolutionary regime here.
Exactly, and you get something like an order parameter, right? It's an order parameter. So joint stories. First of all, people like joint story. These good stories. They always love that, and that's probably how maybe these memes can travel far. I don't know whether we discussed that in a previous meeting about the Piraha language. I think it's called Piraha. Did we discuss that?
We didn't discuss, I don't think, no.
There is a language. No, I'm not a linguist, but there's a language. I think it's called Piraha. And that language is a language of tribes in the Amazonas. And that language does not permit you to talk about things you have not experienced, seen, heard, or deduced yourself. So you essentially cannot talk about things that are kind of transferred over multiple links, which is very interesting because it looks like it's one step before memes become portable, which is very fascinating. Now, I don't know whether there's much known about the history of this language, whether this language never had it or de-evolved this ability, or there was a kind of, lawyer gene that says, unless you can actually have you're a witness, this is hearsay. You cannot use hearsay. I think some person that described the language said that's the language of lawyers, because anything that you have not witnessed yourself is hearsay. You can't use it.
It's
right?
inadmissible in the court of public opinion.
Is an indefensible court of public, in the court of any listener of Piraha. Now, of course, most languages allow this. And in my opinion, that's the usual strength of a language. I can tell you about the huge mountains of ice I've seen, or that my uncle has seen. Not me, indirect, or somebody has seen. And these huge mountains of ice and rivers that are so wide that you can't even swim across it, and things like that. I can talk about this, and you have never seen it. You live in the desert, but you know what water looks like. And I say it's like water, it's just much bigger. And suddenly I can give you information, something that you have no chance of ever seeing in your life, but you can model it now. You have a concept of this. And suddenly your world expands. Your brain expands to encompass these models. And
you might plan a journey for another shore.
Sorry?
You might plan a journey for another shore and find, so someone goes out, discovers some other country that you never saw yourself. And it's like what we know, but more so. It's like the forests are and then you start building ships, and then if it's just like things you've narrowly seen and
exactly. You start being able to, and your world actually increases. It increases far beyond what you ever can experience. And that's a driver of, for example, your brain. I have seen a recent pointer to a paper that claims that there is a gene difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, which might have led to the growth of more neurons in the neocortex in humans. And if that's true, right? As I say, this is a paper just as I saw pointed to that. If that's true, it might be that you have this mutation, suddenly you have more neurons, and with this mutation of more neurons, suddenly you have more space to store all these things that somebody tells you. And lo and behold, suddenly your brain goes big, and you start modeling. Also, you have to model these things. You have to put them in your brain. It's not enough to put them in your brain. You have to have a model how these things interrelate. When I talk about a big body of water to a desert person, then several things have to happen. You have to understand that water can be big, can be dangerous. You say, oh, that trickle of water is not dangerous, and drink this. They say, no, that's dangerous. And suddenly the whole relation with the world becomes much more intricate and complex. And suddenly you also receive an inner world. You don't have just an outer world to play with. You suddenly have an inner world to play with. Vestiges of that exist in animals. We know animals dream.
That's very consistent with Randy Buckner's account of the evolution of the default mode. He was wondering whether some parts of as you just expand the hierarchy, you can get more inner loop dynamics that are divorced from the immediate couplings, giving you more counterfactual abilities and more.
Okay, that's a very interesting. I'd like to have a pointer to that.
Yeah, I'll send that over. It's 2013 or 2011.
Okay, sounds very interesting.
Oh, by the way, I have a meeting coming up shortly after 4.
Yeah. It's also getting quite late here, so it's probably time for dinner.
I would love to do this again when you're ready. So
I'm at your service. I think next week might be possible. I can check that out. But we can also talk by mail and fine tune it. But we can just try to just ping me a day before. I think it's a probably good idea, just in case.
okay, I will do that, and I'll also be pinging you about a potential update on our research project.
Yes, that would be great. And then mail is always, as always, the usual best way to do so. And I thank you for this really fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.